Thank you, Tong, and really appreciate you allowing me to speak here. Things that BPSOS do, it's just phenomenal work, and you are some of the best advocates that I know, and you in particular, Tong. And so I'm just really thankful that you've set up this forum, and also want to thank Commissioner Davey for speaking earlier. And I think a lot of his comments really give a lot of us hope for people to pay attention to what's going on for Montagnard Christians, for religious minorities throughout Vietnam, which continue to face significant persecution. To use, USERV standard, it's egregious, ongoing, and severe, and that's been going on for decades. Before the beginning of USERV, before the IRF Act, going back to the middle of the 20th century. And unfortunately, there's, I think, some difficulty in getting the international community to pay attention to what's happening in Vietnam. It gets kind of not ignored exactly, but put to the side a little bit in relationship to China or to whatever is the particular issue that's happening of the day. And for advocacy to really be successful, and that's what this panel is about, what are the international advocacy options for Montagnard Christians? For advocacy to be successful, it needs to be sustained, it needs to be high level, it needs to be public. There needs to be a significant amount of pushback. It's something that we've seen over and over and over again, that when you have local governments or even the national government that crack down on these religious minority communities, then the only way that they respond is when there is significant international pushback. And we've seen that actually have real effect. Subdivision 179 is one of the areas that Commissioner Davey and Tong, you've raised already, where that has actually had really good initial effects and can be a sort of model for other local governments that are confused or hostile to groups that are minority groups that don't practice the same faith that some majority groups do, that there are real options, and that the international community will applaud those things when they happen, but it's too few, too infrequent when that sort of improvement happens. And unfortunately, instead of the improvements that happened for Subdivision 179 being a kind of model for everywhere else, it looks instead that was sort of a small blip, and that things have actually trended, unfortunately, in a more aggressive posture recently, especially for the Montagnard Christian community. So as Tong mentioned, ADF International, we're a legal and human rights organization based out of Vienna. We work to protect fundamental freedoms for everybody, especially and including the right to religious freedom. I'm part of our global religious freedom team, and we look at the places in the world that have the worst track records when it comes to religious freedom for Christians and for other religious minorities. And unfortunately, one of those places is Vietnam, and among Montagnard Christian communities in the Central Highlands face some of the worst persecution. We've already heard lots of particular instances about prisoners of conscience who are, not that there should be any prisoners of conscience, but who are disproportionately from these communities because the government sees them as somehow hostile, as somehow influenced by foreign governments, as people who they can't control, right? People who want very simple freedoms. That's what's so strange about this, is that these are groups of people who want just basic freedoms, the ability to move from one area to another, to have do the most basic things in life without government interference, to hold religious services without government interference, without harassment and police intimidation. And even these basic freedoms are regularly denied both by the local governments and the national governments in Vietnam. One of the things that's been most concerning recently and is these many instances of retaliation and attempts to silence Montagnard Christian communities but also other religious communities, including Buddhist communities that are not part of the official national churches, for simply wanting to express their faith, for simply wanting to hold religious services, and for communicating when they have their rights violated to international organizations like the United Nations. Recent attacks against Montagnards in the Central Highlands, they've targeted Christian pastors, members of house churches who are engaging with international organizations to help strengthen the fundamental human rights of persecuted Christians in Vietnam. These Christian leaders have been actively reporting violations to the UN, in observing UN-proclaimed international days, making communications to special mechanisms, and participating in training on international human rights law and domestic law. These Christian communities, at the same time that they're doing that, they've also been taking steps to assert their rights under Vietnam's law on religion, on belief in religion, to freely hold worship services without having to register them. Commissioner Davey mentioned, some different possibilities for how the government could take steps, and one of these is that, look, when you're just holding basic religious services, you do not need to, and this is our opinion on reading the law on belief in religion, you don't need to register those services. That's something that needs to be communicated very clearly from the national government to local governments that are trying to restrict people from just having basic religious services. And because these communities have wanted to do that, they've been coordinating on these things because they want to do that. I think the government is starting to crack down and try to prevent them from letting other people know, trying to prevent the international human rights monitoring system from working so that outside groups aren't able to apply pressure. They aren't able to let folks see what's really happening. Government officials, they see these activities as a threat to the communist regime. They're using violence, interrogation, and surprise raids. For the last couple of years, they've been using COVID-19 related pretexts to suppress these activities. Police interrogators frequently use threats of excessively heavy fines, long-term imprisonment, and even death to coerce victims to sign pledges to leave their denomination, to stop reporting violations to human rights organizations, foreign governments, and international bodies. The interrogators frequently threaten victims with prosecution and imprisonment for unauthorized religious activities, and we know from the wide number of prisoners of conscience that they will make good on their threats. So I think it's very, very important that we raise these concerns now, that groups like USERF, like the IRF office, like the UN Special Rapporteurs, raise this stuff now before the new interrogations go to the next stage and become even worse. Victims have been deprived of their cell phones, which are their primary means of communications. They've had a lot of difficulty coming up with money to replace their phones, their different things that have been taken away from them. And then they're deprived of them again in follow-up interrogations sessions. I'll give some examples. One recent example was in Dak Lak province, where police targeted a group of Montagnard Christians, sent dozens of police officers into homes to arrest the victims at dawn, or even earlier than that, while they were in bed. The police, in overwhelming numbers, intimidated the victims and conducted unlawful searches of their homes and seizure of religious materials and electronic devices. Electronic devices were searched at the police station to look for private information regarding communications with international organizations and human rights training. This is something that we see lots of authoritarian governments do. We're seeing Russia do that right now, people trying to leave Russia. We see China doing this, and we see the Vietnamese government doing that. One of the victims of some of these recent interrogations is a 19-year-old Montagnard student, E.Q. Ngai, who lives with 8 other family members outside of some of the villages in Krong Buk district. E.Q. Ngai was subjected to targeted intimidation that included 6 separate police summons within a 4-day period. A group of police officers staged around-the-clock supervision of his family and home on most days during a 28-day period. The teenager's family is much poorer than others in the community because of his parents' long-term health issues and refusal by the government to provide financial assistance to them, assistance that the family is entitled to under Vietnamese regulations. Members of the surrounding community are afraid they will suffer from retaliation if they provide employment to him or his family. and to a family that's being monitored so tightly by security forces. Ekunye appears to have been targeted, in part at least, because members of his family have been particularly vocal in their support of religious freedom and for leadership among the Montagnard Evangelical Church community. And that church community has been targeted by the Vietnamese government for quite a while. We've had multiple pastors who've been prisoners of conscience who have been adopted by members of Congress, by USERF, in order to get them free. In any event, this is just one example of the trend of ongoing intimidation and violence that is currently being used in an effort to suppress communications between Christians in Vietnam and international human rights organizations that are seeking to help them. But there are lots of these different examples. There have been dozens of communications to the UN about what's going on. These increased aggressive interrogations, this harassment against religious communities in Vietnam, based on those communications with international human rights organizations. It's not just happening against among the Montagnard Christians or other indigenous Christians. It's happening against a lot of religious groups whose members are part of the dominant ethnic group there, but they're just unregistered, being of Cao Dai, Buddhist, Hua, terrible pronunciation, Hua Ao Buddhist. You're just seeing this all over the place. There's also been a lot of use of social media recently to target these communities, to marginalize them, to threaten them with violence. This widespread and consistent nature of these increasing interrogations, these increasing harassment measures, seems to indicate that this isn't just local governments doing that, but that there may be some coordination from the national government in encouraging this. In any event, all of these are egregious violations of international law. It's an egregious violation to retaliate against individuals when they contact international institutions about human rights violations that they are experiencing, or to try to prevent them from doing that in the first place. Without the ability to monitor human rights conditions on the ground in countries, international institutions like USERF, like the UN, like the Earth Office, they cannot function in one of their basic duties, which is to hold governments accountable and provide victims some kind of remedy. It seems clear, at least to me, that the government of Vietnam is aware that local groups are working with international human rights organizations and international institutions to help strengthen the protection of human rights and religious freedom in the country and for their communities. The government wants to instill fear in these communities, so they stop reporting these violations. They want to prevent local communities from educating themselves about international and domestic law and asserting their rights, like the right to freely worship, especially for these small house churches. And so there's a couple of different things that we would recommend. I was really pleased to hear Commissioner Davey say that he's considering, and USERF is considering holding a hearing on the status of religious freedom in Vietnam. That's, I think, one of the best ways to raise this issue so that the Vietnamese government doesn't believe that international organizations are just going to let these things slide. I would encourage the Earth Office to really push for CPC designation this year, because I do think that these are escalatory steps. This is widespread harassment, widespread silencing on a major and fundamental mechanism for international institutions to be able to monitor human rights situations. So I think that's very important, that a message is sent to Vietnam that if they do escalate, then other countries will call them out on it and may escalate as well. There can also be sanctions provided to individual officials based on the Global Magnitsky Act, some other sanctions, targeted sanctions mechanisms for those government officials in Vietnam who are perpetrating gross human rights violations like torture. Government of Vietnam, they need to cease their interrogations, cease this intimidation, cease the discriminatory practices. And I think it would help to raise people like Ekunye's profile so that others see what's happening, see the real effects of what's going on. It helps to reach out to specific embassies for these international organizations, so that they're able to tell the Vietnamese government, you know, we're watching this situation. We're looking at what's happening. We know what's happening despite your efforts. And it's important in the same measure that international civil society organizations also come together to provide a united front in defense of religious minorities, in defense of Montagnard Christians, whichever forum that they're working at, especially, for example, at the United Nations, with some of the special mechanisms like the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, freedom of expression, lots of different mechanisms there who can provide some kind of reporting, some kind of accountability for these things. I'm hopeful that with these upcoming meetings between the U.S. and Vietnam, the U.S. will take that as a real opportunity to press Vietnam on these human rights measures, especially as we see, you know, throughout the world, a lot of authoritarian governments now feel emboldened because of you know, Russia, because of China, and we need to be able to apply pressure and say that this is not something that any of us are going to stand for. So again, thanks to BPSOS, and happy to answer questions when we have that time.